Good evening. Welcome to this evening's public lecture. I'm Sally Shortall. I'm a professor in the university and I co-chair the public lecture committee. Tonight's lecture is by Jack Shenker and it's titled, Now We Have Your Attention, Pandemics, Politics and Protests from Below. I'll be back in about half an hour for a live question and answer session with Jack. If you would like to ask a question, you can do so by using the drop-down chat function on your YouTube, or you can tweet us your question at InsightsNCL. If you would like to tweet about the lecture while it's ongoing, please use hashtag InsightsNCL. So enjoy the lecture and I will see you shortly. And here to introduce Jack more fully is my co-chair, Dr. Martin Farr.
If it's true that it's better to live in interesting times, then I think we've been spoilt of late, as well as living through a major historic event which necessitates this form of communication. We've also lived in the last 3 years through the expenses scandal, the Windrush scandal, Grenfell Tower, austerity, Brexit, and of course now the COVID-19 pandemic. These have all taken place in the world created in large part by another global catastrophe, the 2008 financial crisis. The consequences of that were manifold. They included the reanimating of civil society and of reviving an interest in politics on the part of many people who had perhaps hitherto been passive. There was increased readership of journals and magazines and newspapers, and people watching and listening to podcasts and programs to try and understand and explain what had happened. There was more radicalism, there was more conflict, and there was more organisation. There was also more research by academics into what happened and its consequences. But critically, alongside that, is the role of journalists and journalism, who can bring to the study of such subjects warmth and colour and empathy, and crucially go beyond the campus and the metropolis into the country more widely. This evening's speaker has done that throughout his career. He's been a foreign correspondent for The Guardian, travelled across the UK in his research for this book, including coming to Newcastle. He has, like the best journalists, a vivid style, and like the best journalists, a very clear idea of telling detail to illustrate a point. And he does so effectively that his book was shortlisted for the George Orwell Prize for Political Journalism. Since its publication, society has endured and is enduring another major crisis on which I'm sure he'll reflect on what promises to be a highly stimulating and engaging lecture. So, on Now We Have Your Attention, Pandemics, Protest and Politics from Below, Jack Shenker.
Good evening. We live in an age of crisis. It fills the air around us and seeps into all the cracks. The so-called Great Moderation of the 1990s and 2000s, a period in which many influential figures began to speak of the end of history, the final triumph of free market liberalism, a world in which ideology was dead and the only political struggle remaining was between rival technocrats competing to manage the status quo most efficiently. That illusion has long crumbled. Ideology is dead. Chaos is commonplace, and again the fabric of our institutional politics appears to be coming apart at the seams. That was true before the arrival of a generation-defining global pandemic, and it's truer now than ever. In Britain, when the age of crisis is analysed for us on television and in the papers, it's usually images of Westminster that we're shown, and it's primarily politicians' voices that we hear. My journalism, and particularly my most recent book, Now We Have Your Attention, tries to tell a different story. It travels not to the great citadels of power, but to the margins instead, places that lie off the edge of the page, shady corners into which news cameras rarely reach. It argues that it's the people dwelling in these spaces who can best explain why our present feels so unstable. It believes that if we want to find the future, or at least understand the struggles that will forge the future, then we must look here. And so I'm going to start this evening by talking about someone who works at the very heart of the British government, although I doubt their name will be familiar to you. Someone who I think reveals a great deal about where our politics is today, where it's going, and what opportunities exist for new forms of political organising that respond to the times we live in. That person's name is Fatima Diallo. She was born in the West African state of Guinea-Bissau, and her long, complicated journey to the UK began back in the 1970s when she was just 12 years old, and her mother handed her a bus ticket from their village to the city. Fatima's mother had sold her own bed to raise the money for it. She wanted me to study, and she ended up sleeping on the floor to make that possible, remembers Fatima. To this day, I'm the only one of my siblings who can read or write. Ever since then, Fatima has been pushing open doors into the unknown. In the port town of Bissau, she studied hard and dreamed of becoming a doctor, but the fees for medical school were too high. So instead, Fatima became a secretary, typing by day and living frugally by night, saving and saving until, at the age of 17, she could finally afford a plane ticket to Lisbon. There, she hoped to continue her education, but ended up being forced into low-paid work instead. In 2008, in the thick of the global financial crisis, Fatima folded up her life yet again and made her way to London. She knew it would be tough, like Lisbon was, and Bissau before it, and her home village before that, because ultimately, she told me, everywhere is tough, even if the shape and texture of that toughness varies from place to place, and the strain feels differently against your skin. But I thought things would be better, she said. I wanted to become a bus driver. Bus drivers, she explained to me, have secure jobs and get to explore vast portions of the city. They're a highly visible part of the urban infrastructure, and everyone can see how much they're needed. I had lots of hopes when I arrived here, said Fatima, but that's life. Nothing works out as you planned. For the past decade, far from exploring vast portions of the city, Fatima has run on rails. She wakes up in the early hours of the morning to be in with a chance of being able to use the bathroom at her small house in Stratford, East London, which she shares with 9 strangers. Some are Italian, she thinks, and some might be Eastern European, but nobody socialises with one another as they're all too busy working, so she can't really be sure. Almost every possession Fatima owns remains permanently packed in 2 large suitcases because she knows what the landlord is capable of. He demands payments in cash and retains a personal key to every room. I have my creams and my hair products out on the side table, and that's it, she explains. When he throws me out onto the street, I'll be ready. By 6:30 a.m, she's on the tube and heading to the Ministry of Justice headquarters near St James's Park for the first of 2 jobs. Over the next 9 hours, she will walk up and down 16 floors of UK government office space, cleaning each of the male and female toilets on every floor 5 times per working day. She will walk for miles and miles and miles until 5 p.m, when she'll gather up her things, walk down the road for half a mile more, and begin another set of cleaning rounds, this time at the Supreme Court. For all this, she will be paid just above the legal minimum wage for her age. By the time she gets home, it will be past 9 p.m, and she will be exhausted. She spends her weekends at home, queuing up to use the house's single washing machine and catching up on sleep. And then, on Monday, she'll start all over again. It isn't any kind of life, she says. But on the day I interviewed Fatima, she was living a very different kind of life. On that day, a wet August afternoon back in 2018, she was on strike for a living wage, spinning in the middle of a Westminster pavement as rain poured from the sky, with glitter on her face and strips of ticker tape in her hair. She was blowing on a horn and dancing deliriously, flanked by a line of security guards on one side and a line of police officers on the other. The air was fat with music and shouting and flare smoke and promise. And Fatima, now aged 54, was at the heart of it all, walking through yet another doorway into the unknown. Now Fatima, a low-paid, migrant, outsourced cleaner, was once the kind of worker that traditional trade unions wrote off as being impossible for them to reach and organise. She and her colleagues were too insecure, too fragmented by shift patterns and linguistic barriers, too hidden behind casual temporary contracts and third-party agencies. But today, thanks to changes in our economy that have taken place over the past 4 decades, and which intensified, particularly in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, workers like Fatima are increasingly not an exception, but the norm. Even before coronavirus, Britain's workers were poorer than ever. Since 2008, real wages in the UK have fallen by a percentage point every year. And by the mid-2010s, the typical worker was earning 10% less than they were before 2008. This is now the most protracted fall in working incomes since the Napoleonic Wars. 7 in 10 workers in the UK are now chronically broke, according to a major study by the Royal Society of Arts. While 7 million people in Britain living below the breadline today, that's 2/3 of all those in poverty, are in jobs, but jobs that simply do not pay enough. And as well as being poorer, Britain's workers are more insecure. Up to 10 million people are now estimated to be in some form of precarious work, a trend that stretches well beyond the newfangled gig economy and into occupations that have existed for centuries, like teaching, caring and hospitality, as well as traditionally high-status professional occupations, which are witnessing growing casualisation among entry-level graduates, part of what some are calling the proletarianisation of the professional classes. To give some idea of where all those 10 million insecure workers are, the UK cleaning sector alone, where Fatima works, employs no less than 700,000 people, which is all a long way of saying that Fatima is part of a precarious workforce that is already hugely dominant in our current economy, and which is expanding fast. And that what matters to her, the decisions she takes about how to navigate this moment of political flux, this febrile cocktail of both immiseration and opportunity, those decisions matter to us all. And so in my book, I tell the story of Fatima's transformation into what she was on that wet August afternoon on the pavements of Westminster, a trade union organiser and fearless strike leader who, against all the odds, has marched out of her workplace on multiple occasions with most of her colleagues behind her, and who has forced some of the most powerful state and private institutions in this country to listen to her concerns. And I tell the story too of the workers' movement that helped make those strikes happen. In particular, an organisation called United Voices of the World, or UVW, one of a new breed of insurgent grassroots trade unions made up of workers that the older legacy unions had often given up on, but whose lived experience of work in this age of crisis has educated and radicalised them into taking direct action. UVW, which is democratically run by its own members, which has existed for less than a decade and whose entire annual expenditure is less than the single salary of Len McCluskey, General Secretary of Unite, Britain's biggest union, UVW has won victory after victory in recent years, driving up wages and securing better rights for low-paid, invisible workers everywhere, from multinational banks at Canary Wharf to NHS hospitals and even the offices of the Daily Mail. They've done it by being unabashedly loud, confrontational and political, linking their members' struggles at work explicitly with wider but interrelated issues like the cost of housing and systemic racism. As one of UVW's senior organisers once explained to me, we're a fighting members-led union because through us, our members are struggling to be active agents in their workplace and beyond, to redefine their relationship not just with their bosses, but also with the city they live in, the communities around them. When it comes to analysing and explaining the age of crisis, the politics that got us here, the battles being waged over what comes next, you won't find many mentions of Fatima or UVW in the media. Why does that matter? Well, let's just take a moment to frame the wider crisis that I'm talking about. We know that in 2008, the economic paradigm which has moulded Britain and much of the planet beyond it for 40 years, a set of principles based around free markets, movable money and competition, imploded. It didn't die altogether, not least because those in power moved heaven and earth to stitch it back together, using audacious innovations to drive it forward harder and faster than ever before. But the justifications offered up for its existence no longer chimed with the lived reality of millions. Basic protections that many had come to expect from the state were stripped away. For many more, the fundamental components of a decent life, a secure job and home, a sense of one's place in the world, drifted further and further out of reach. New divisions emerged between those whose existing assets or status were swollen by this latest aggressive iteration of capitalism and those who were impoverished by it. By the end of the last decade, growth in life expectancy was stalling for the first time in 100 years. Average household debt had hit record highs, and 135,000 children were homeless at Christmas. In the gap between the mindset of a sclerotic governing class and the daily experiences of its citizens, we also know that in the years following the financial crisis, particularly during the last half-decade or so in the UK, rebellions began to take root. These rebellions came from the left and the right, from the young and the old. They manifested themselves at the ballot box, on the ground, and in a vast array of different forms. The result was two highly contentious referendums that convulsed the country, 3 general elections in quick succession, which threw up wildly differing results, and the slow motion unravelling of our elite organs of governance, once an international byword for endurance and stability. For better or worse, all of this tumult has expanded our shared sense of political possibility. Britain has recently come within a few thousand votes of putting a radical socialist administration into office, and it's also delivered a landslide victory to the most right-wing government of the modern era. Yet to most of those whom we rely upon to navigate the political landscape on our behalf, all these shocks and surprises appeared utterly mystifying. In search of answers, reporters and pundits converged on Whitehall, Downing Street and the House of Commons. In other words, the site of the symptoms rather than the causes. The coverage was breathless. We had hung parliaments and legislative deadlock, constitutional bedlam and fallen prime ministers. But at the heart of all of it, there was an epic absence. The politics presented to us was commentated on like a sporting event, a spectacle played out by a select few over there, something for the rest of us to watch from our sofas and boo or cheer. There was rarely any notion of how all of this turmoil was entangled with politics in its wider, deeper form, a living thing that runs through Fatima as it runs through all of us. Politics is something which alters ordinary people, and which ordinary people in turn are capable of altering for themselves. What a funny contained emergency it is, noted the economics writer Aditya Chakraborty back in 2019. It's as if the revolution of 1789 was being covered entirely from inside the Versailles court of Louis XVI. My book is a search for that wider, deeper politics, narrated for the most part by those who too often find themselves being talked about rather than listened to. And it's also, I hope, an intervention. At a moment when things are falling apart and the outlines of the next paradigm remain unclear, the book makes an argument about how we should be sifting through the rubble and the sort of fights that must be won if we're to construct a fairer, better future. At the core of this argument is a simple claim that after a long stretch in which we were told, wrongly, that politics was resolved, the years to come will in fact be marked by agitation and opportunity, and that far from being passengers on a grim ride that we can't escape from, we are all political agents with a crucial part to play in determining where we go from here. I think the best people to teach us this are people like Fatima, people at the sharp end of the age of crisis who have found new means of demanding our attention and of bending politics to their will. The organisations I write about in the book, of which UVW is just one example, are relatively small in and of themselves, and they congregate in crevices, from a dank club night in Brighton to a far-flung industrial estate on the outskirts of Newcastle, in fact, and a shabby shopfront in Scotland many miles to the north. But the various communities they represent are huge and growing. Their concerns are our shared concerns, and their next steps will affect us all. They include those at the sharp end of Britain's housing crisis, for example, particularly private renters who have achieved what was often thought to be impossible in this country, namely the formation of tenants' unions like Acorn, which operates nationally, and the London Renters' Union in the capital, both of whom are pioneering new ways for private renters to act collectively in fighting for their rights, resisting egregious rent rises and holding landlords to account. I cover migrant collectives challenging the hostile environment regime, young people mobilising around the climate emergency, and, because new forms of organising that take advantage of this moment of expanded political possibility in the age of crisis are not solely the preserve of the left, far from it, I also look at far-right movements too, especially those gaining ground in post-industrial areas of Britain, where there has been a mainstream narrative void regarding why some communities have been so disadvantaged by modern market liberalism, a void filled very successfully by proto-fascistic movements. In my opinion, to really understand the multiple intersecting crises enveloping us, to really untangle and tease out where that pervasive sense of uncertainty and upheaval comes from, and to do so not just as an academic exercise, but as a means of influencing our political trajectory, these are the stories we need to tell, and these are the voices we need to listen to. The cultural theorist Stuart Hall once said, and it's an observation that resonates with me incredibly strongly, that there are always energies, people, societies on the margin, those who can't express themselves within the dominant structure. What is to come will come as a result of those forces who are outside, beginning to trouble, undermine, subvert, and haunt the nightmares of the present, just at the moment when the present thinks it's closed. That haunting is all around us, and it's what so many of those who have never bumped up against the hard edges of the status quo fail to understand. What comes next, in a way that actually seemed almost inconceivable in the relatively staid and consensual days of the mid-2000s, has in recent years become open wide and up for grabs. That then is the political terrain upon which coronavirus landed earlier this year. And COVID, of course, has unleashed a new set of social catastrophes, nested inside a great many existing social catastrophes, like a Russian doll. And what we've realised in our attempts to hold back the pandemic is that tackling it has involved exposing all of those social catastrophes, including low pay, including insecure housing, including racial inequalities, to the light. The disease's transmission lines have often proved to be the very cracks we've been talking about this evening: poverty, precariousness, the insecurity of not having a dependable roof over one's head. And our instinctive responses to it, such as the establishment of local mutual aid groups, have drawn on the very forms of self-organised and collective politics explored in the book as well. It's little wonder that polling suggests only 9% of people in Britain desire a complete return to normal after COVID-19. This pandemic has forced all of us to contemplate the kind of questions articulated by Fatima and others like her in the book, questions regarding the extent to which we think of ourselves as part of a collective, questions about what it truly means to be safe or free. And so I'd like to reflect briefly on how Fatima and her cleaning colleagues at the Ministry of Justice have experienced coronavirus so far, which is a subject I've written about extensively this summer, which I think help illuminate the nature of the new politics that I've been talking about. Most of you, I'm sure, will remember the dramatic moment on March 23rd when Boris Johnson addressed the nation and announced for the first time, "From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction: you must stay at home." For Fatima and the rest of the outsourced cleaners, that lockdown never existed. Although nearly all of the ministry's civil servants and administrative staff switched to working from home, along with some of the managers responsible for the cleaning team, the cleaners themselves were designated key workers and ordered to continue coming in as normal. Shorn of support or guidance and often unable to track down their bosses, the cleaners tried to ask questions about PPE and workplace safety, and most importantly, about occupational sick pay, something that none of them received. Fatima and her colleagues pointed out that with most of the cleaners living on the poverty line as it is, anyone needing to self-isolate due to suspected coronavirus would probably be unable to do so unless occupational sick pay was granted to them. Statutory sick pay of just under £96 a week is simply not enough to cover even basic rent. And as a result, those that were ill would be forced to come in and risk infecting others. In response, OCS, the outsourcing giant which employs the cleaners, a company privately owned by the Goodliff family, who, according to the Sunday Times Rich List, are worth almost £200 million, the OCS and the Ministry of Justice either shifted responsibility between each other or declined to reply at all. An investigation into this carried out by myself and by colleagues over many weeks, and which collected dozens of hours of corroborated worker testimony, as well as a cache of leaked documents and emails, revealed multiple occasions upon which the cleaners brought up their concerns, only to be fobbed off or lied to or ignored. As Britain braced for disaster, these so-called key workers were left to fend for themselves. It was scary and depressing, remembers Fatima, of those early, eerie days when the computer people, as she calls the ministry's office workers, had nearly all disappeared, and the security guards were the only other faces to be seen on site. Benito Medina, a 40-year-old cleaner from the Canary Islands, told me that he panicked on his first encounter with mile upon mile of deserted corridors. "You have this fear that something bad is going to happen to you," he said. And something bad did happen. Circulating in small teams through a near-deserted building, sweeping carpets that had not been walked upon, and wiping down desks that were not being used, the cleaners began to fall ill with COVID-like symptoms, one after another, with no formal support network to help them when they needed help the most. Those compelled by hardship to carry on working felt terrified, while those that took it upon themselves to obey official guidelines and self-isolate at home were either stripped of their pay or dismissed. By late April, with several of the cleaners struck down with suspected coronavirus, some extremely seriously, United Voices of the World, that's Fatima's trade union, wrote a formal letter to both OCS, the outsourcing company, and to Robert Buckland's QC, Secretary of State for Justice, setting out major concerns over the way workers were being treated and accusing OCS of taking no meaningful action to protect the health of their cleaners. The letter warned that the consequences of this were potentially deadly and concluded the cleaners believe they are putting themselves and others in serious, imminent and unavoidable danger. OCS responded to UVW's official complaint several days later, insisting that the company was operating in full compliance with Public Health England guidelines and had been working hard to protect the well-being of its staff. Their reply came too late. By that point, not one, but two outsourced workers at the Ministry of Justice who had fallen sick were already dead. One of them, just like Fatima, was a migrant cleaner from Guinea-Bissau. His name was Emmanuel Gomez. He died aged 43 years old, leaving behind a wife and children. And out of fear of losing both his pay and his job if he took any time off, he had continued to come into work up to and including the night before he died, despite having a fever and barely being able to stand. When his fellow cleaners saw him that night and suggested that they call him an ambulance, he refused and insisted that he had to work his shift. After eventually allowing himself to be taken home on public transport, Emmanuel was so dizzy and disorientated, according to a colleague, that when they reached Victoria Station, he had no idea where he was. I won't go into full details of that story now because we don't have time, but anyone who's interested can check out the original investigation online, and I'm happy to discuss it further in the Q&A. The scandal of what happened at the Ministry of Justice was subsequently raised in Parliament, forcing a government climb down. It is now belatedly providing full sick pay for cleaners like Fatima if they have to self-isolate due to coronavirus. And I should add that the Ministry of Justice denies any wrongdoing. You can hear their side of the story as far as it goes in the full piece. OCS, the outsourcing company, has refused to comment at all on any of the revelations, and you can read into that what you will. But the reason I wanted to flag this up here is that what Fatima and her colleagues went through this year underscores the point I've been making about the new forms of politics that are arising from the age of crisis, a dynamic that the COVID-19 pandemic is exacerbating. The virus itself may not discriminate between humans, but the nation it has wreaked havoc on most certainly does. A nation fractured by inequalities, but one in which the contours of power and opportunity are actually more malleable than might first appear. The only reason we're aware of the coronavirus scandal at the Ministry of Justice is that the cleaners themselves strive to pull all the threads together and to speak out. The week after Emmanuel's death in late April, on International Workers' Memorial Day, appropriately enough, Fatima and several of her colleagues walked unilaterally off the job. They've since forced their employer into crucial concessions. Both the Ministry of Justice and OCS are now facing a variety of legal claims, and UVW, the trade union, has just made history by winning a formal recognition agreement at the government department. We beat their union busting and won our rights, Fatima told me. It's us that has to go into the Ministry of Justice each day looking for the virus, to clean it, to chase it away. I think they believe we are drones, that our lives are not worth anything. I don't know why, maybe because we're foreigners. All we wanted was decent information and to be treated as human beings. Now we go for full victory. Vitally, UVW is now collaborating with some of the tenants' unions I mentioned earlier, training each other's members on workplace struggles and on how to resist evictions. The point is that, yes, the age of crisis is creating uncertainty, it's driving insecurity, and it's deepening divisions. Yet from that morass, from that chaos that fills the air around us, new forms of hope, a new politics of solidarity and collectivity is out there, beginning to take shape, and that the tools are in our hands to fight for the Britain we want to see. We're not condemned to be mere spectators at the end of the old world, however much our diet of 24-hour rolling news often makes us feel like that. If Fatima can seize this moment to organise, to assert her presence, to shape things, then so can you and I. I'll end with this. In the American South of the 1930s and 40s, legions of baseball correspondents filed scrupulously balanced articles detailing the highlights of each match, the transfers from one team to another, the internal dramas that formed the backbone of every season. With very few exceptions, none of them ever commented on the fact that US baseball leagues were racially segregated at the time, or that the informal baseball colour line was being progressively undermined by a nascent civil rights movement that would go on to change the country's history. Those correspondents operated within the boundaries of the system they reported on, and rarely questioned its underlying structure or the wider social mobilisations that were already rendering it an anachronism. Albeit in a different context, I think that something similar has characterised political journalism here during recent years. The UK press is sometimes described as suffering from a lack of diversity, and the charge is a fair one, but it doesn't only apply to the racial, gender and class backgrounds of its personnel. Crucially, the media has also failed to diversify its thinking, to move beyond the narrow confines and limited horizons of the political assumptions that came before. By and large, I think that journalists have failed to seek out those who understand the age of crisis and the new politics it's producing, because they live it day in and day out for themselves. I hope that the book and this talk provides something of a small corrective, and that in the process it sketches out the beginnings of a struggle for tomorrow that's fraught with both danger and also possibility. As the author Rebecca Solnit puts it in one of my favourite quotes, "The future is dark, with a darkness as much of the womb as of the grave." Thank you very much.
So Jack, thank you for such an interesting and stimulating lecture and for your positive final note. So we have some questions coming in, so I'm just going to kick straight into those. So the first one is, how serious a crisis and how unique an opportunity is this? In the 1980s and 90s, there was organisation, there were protest movements, but no sense of the prevailing attitudes and practices changing. Is it different this time?
So what a fantastic question. And it's something I think about a lot, that sense of to what extent we are in a particularly unique historical period. And the questioner is absolutely right to reference the 1980s, the 70s, of course, as well, being a time of great political turmoil. And even in, you know, the sort of what I described as the staid and consensual days of sort of, you know, third way centrism through the late 90s and 2000s, of course, there are incredibly important political struggles going on. But I do think there's something fundamentally different about the moment we're in now. And particularly that relates to the life chances and opportunities of young people. Now, I think the generational divide can be overstated. It doesn't define everything in our politics at the moment. But the fact is that right now, and this was not the case in the 1980s, even though, of course, there was huge youth unemployment and kind of, you know, cultural struggles, especially, as well as working class struggles, and that affected lots of young people. You know, in the 1980s, you had a huge proportion of young people voting for the Conservatives and voting for Thatcher. We indelibly link young people with the left and Labour now, but that is a relatively new phenomenon in recent decades, you know, of our politics. The fact is that right now, so many young people feel locked out of any meaningful opportunities. The things that they were told that they would get from coming out of school, getting a university degree, you know, those basics of a secure job, a home, you know, the chance to build a, you know, quote unquote conventional secure life, those have been snatched away from them. And I think that, combined with the context of climate change, which of course we haven't mentioned yet, and is particularly relevant to young people in an existential way, makes this a particularly unique moment. And I'll just say very quickly, you know, a survey came out very recently. I tweeted it if anyone's interested, saying that millennials in the UK are the most dissatisfied with democracy. And I think that there's very good reasons for that. Not that I'm anti-democracy, but just that the kind of democracy that we have at the moment, the institutional democracy, is clearly failing young people. And I'll just read this quote from one of the climate camp organisers, not climate camp, sorry, the student climate walkouts, the strikes that we saw earlier this year. And he told me, The kids who are walking out of school on climate strikes have a hugely radical understanding of the way that politics works, and they recognise that our democratic processes and structures as they stand are designed to uphold the status quo. These are the children of the financial crisis who know they'll be worse off than their parents, know that they'll never own a home, and they know that on current trends, they'll probably live to see the end of humanity. So for them and for us, politics is not a game, it's reality, and that's reflected in the way we organise relentlessly, radically, as if our lives depend on it. And I think that is the difference right now.
And I think that's really interesting. I have two 22-year-old sons who often tell me I can't understand that what they are able to aspire to and presume will be their normal life course is completely different to what it was for me. So I hear exactly what you're saying. So our next question is, given the important role that low-paid key workers have played during the COVID-19 pandemic, are you optimistic that their voices will be heard in the future?
Another great question. And I'd have to say that certainly, again, on the institutional level, and at least in the short term, no, I'm not optimistic. I think the hypocrisy, the shameless hypocrisy of this government in kind of venerating the figures of key workers whilst presiding over an economy, getting us to come out and clap for carers and applaud those that are keeping our communities going, while simultaneously presiding over an economy that has immiserated and impoverished key workers in all kinds of different ways, whether they be a privatized care worker working for an agency who is having to go in and out of different care homes and not being paid for their travel time, and something which has obviously contributed to the pandemic itself, or whether they be Amazon delivery workers. Amazon relies on an economic model that permits the kind of casualization of labour that we see when we have somebody knocking at our door with a parcel. So I'm not convinced that this government will necessarily do anything to help low-pay workers. But where I am optimistic is that low-pay workers themselves are getting organised, and in the long run, I think that will make a difference. And there's much more about this in my book. I'll just give you one really quick example. I know I'm going on much too long with these answers, but in terms of this idea of workers using the tools that make them more precarious, using those as advantage points, exploitative points to kind of go back against management. I relate in my book the story of sort of Uber Eats and Deliveroo riders who go on strike back in 2016, and they have this fantastic system of because there's just algorithmic management. There are no kind of Deliveroo kind of bosses on the ground. They're able to start creating new accounts when you get free money to make an order. They create new accounts and exploit that loophole. And as each new Deliveroo rider arrives to where they were gathering with the free food, they chant, "Log out, join our protest." And for the Deliveroo managers sitting in their offices, often abroad in America, suddenly all these Deliveroo riders in London go offline, and then they reappeared outside Deliveroo's London headquarters en masse. It must have been absolutely terrifying, and Deliveroo caved in and gave them the pay rise they were granted. So that's just a very small example of the way that these tools that weaken workers can also be used to strengthen their struggles.
Yeah, that's excellent, and feeds nicely into your next question, which is, how significant do you think social media has been in the rise of grassroots organisations?
Yeah, well, it's been hugely significant in two different ways. Firstly, because it is an organising tool for grassroots movements, and an incredibly important one. I think pretty much without exception, every single grassroots organisation and movement that I meet and examine in the book has relied on social media to build its profile and to reach new people. And certainly, for example, some of the tenants unions I've been talking about, they've been able to use that kind of method of recruitment and to spread awareness and gain numbers. But I think social media is also relevant in the sense that our politics more widely is occurring online more and more, and that the spaces in which that's playing out are private corporate spaces. Facebook, Twitter, these are corporate platforms, and I think that that's a huge and troubling dynamic within our political sphere at the moment. Just as we looked with alarm at the kind of old company towns of the late 19th century that Upton Sinclair wrote about in America, where you had huge mines and whole mining communities that were entirely the preserve of a huge mega corporation and basically had their own private laws and discipline. So we've kind of acquiesced quite quietly to the creation of sort of digital company towns, where we go about our business. And again, that's something I address a lot in the book, and that I think the problem isn't social media itself and the technology. The problem is the economic model underlying it. And if we care about having a democratic political space in which to thrash out our differences, then we must democratize these spaces as well and check the economic power of some of these social media giants.
Great. And once again, and this I think will be your final question because it's all that we have time for, your answer feeds nicely into this, which is, would you like to comment on the role of mainstream media in all of this, and the way in which mainstream media is becoming more politically and ideologically aligned, or at least that political and ideological alignment is becoming more visible?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I mentioned at the end of my talk there that analogy with the baseball correspondents in the American South in the 30s and 40s, who were very dutiful in the way they reported on matches, but sort of failed to mention the segregation and the colour line, and the way that they were sort of rendered obsolete by events. And I do think there is a much wider problem in our media. And I'm not here just talking about the sort of incredibly rabid, say, kind of extreme anti-migrant sentiment that we see in some particular kind of tabloids and mid-market titles. I'm also just talking more generally about mainstream liberal media, which, and I have many colleagues in that part of the media industry, and I write for many of those newspapers, and I'm very proud to do so. But I think there is a very deep problem institutionally, in the sense that in the last decade, as this crisis has been unfolding, many political journalists have operated intellectually within the boundaries of the system they're reporting on, which is why many disruptions and shocks to our political system in the past few years, whether one agrees with them or not, and I'm thinking here, say, Brexit, and I'm also thinking of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party. I'm sure people on this call will have very different opinions on both of those topics. But I think it's also fair to say that most of the media had no idea how to respond to those developments, and I think failed to do a good job in explaining what was underlying them, and from hearing the voices of those that helped make those things happen. And that's a serious issue, and has helped kind of drive further rounds of political resentment, and anti-media sentiment and kind of surprising political shocks. So we need to democratize our media. I try and support the independent grassroots media myself. That doesn't mean there's no place for mainstream media, but it does mean that we need to expand our intellectual and political horizons and produce journalism that is equal to this moment we're living through, because that's not just desirable, it's essential if we're going to come out the other side.
Jack Shenker, thank you for a fantastic lecture and for being our guest this evening.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you to everyone who's gathered on a cold and dark Thursday evening to spend 45 minutes with us all. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. Yes. If any of our audience would like to make a comment or let us know if you have suggestions, please email us at public.lectures@newcastle.ac.uk. And we hope that some of you might join us next Tuesday, November 24th, when we have a lecture titled Poetry That Will Live and Do Good, Reimagining Wordsworth, with Jeff Cowton from the Wordsworth Trust. So thank you, everyone. Thanks again, Jack. And I hope you all have a nice dark Thursday evening.